Hello and welcome to another episode of The Novel Brain with Dr. E. Today I'm going to be examining the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, and particularly looking at the importance of where you may be on the spectrum of experiencing others, or even looking at the differences between you and other people. So stay tuned. This is all very, very important in our development as a community. So about this time 10 years ago, I was approaching my very first position as a professor in psychology. And as I was sort of examining my career trajectory, I knew that work in social justice and intercultural sensitivity was going to be at the forefront of what drove me to investigating a lot of different research and really just teaching a lot of different models and theories that I thought could help my students in working in the schools and with families. So one of the things that really resonated with me is about year two, so about 2012 for me, I came across what's called the Intercultural Sensitivity Scale. So if you were a little kind of unfamiliar with this, there was a paper that was entitled A Developmental Approach to Training for Intercultural Sensitivity. And there was even something called the Intercultural Development Inventory, or the IDI. Interestingly, I had taken a beautiful office off of the Chicago River over after the then professor turned assistant dean, Dr. McGrath, had moved into her new position and was working very heavily in cultural sensitivity and how we could train or at least identify areas of improvement for professors to really focus on knowing our cultural sensitivity, in particular intercultural sensitivity. I'm going to go over that. So this is a lot in one episode, but I'm going to try and do this piecemeal a little bit because it's all very important. So as I adopted her office, Dr. McGrath and I just kind of joked that I was going to be taking on a lot of work that was before us, and she was very invested. So I joined a lot of different committees and chaired some committees across the graduate school, both internationally and just really on Chicago's campus, to focus on bringing this to our faculty at some point. And little did I know that about 3 or 4 years later, in 2017, and maybe even to the 2016th year, I was leading the faculty on a lot of different initiatives. And we had already talked about the IDI, as I mentioned earlier. This is an Intercultural Development Inventory. And the reason I'm giving you a little bit of this context is it was the first time that our university, since 1971, had really examined really the competence of a professor who's teaching a very objective profession such as psychology. I mean, seemingly we want it to be as objective as possible, but how do we really know that the psychologists in front of us are not on sort of an improvement scale where they could be with their own biases to culture? So my particular department, which was in the school psychology department, really took it on ourselves. I remember Dr. Hughes, this is Candace Hughes, an old colleague of mine who, if you are listening, well, hello, it's been quite a while. And if not, I would like to talk with you again one day about how we instituted the IDI for our own department and students as a model to share it with the university and therefore be an example as to we are looking at ourselves, and we can no longer really work optimally with our clients of many different cultures unless we kind of understood where we were on this scale. So this was developed by Dr. Mitchell Hamill and Dr. Milton Bennett. And when they did develop it, it was really laid out in these papers, particularly the one I mentioned earlier in Dr. Bennett's work. But it's really kind of come back to me now because experiencing difference is really, really being pronounced right now in American culture and, of course, across the world. And I really just want to identify all the different stages. So let's start it out. And I'm going to outline this as easy as I can. And then I'm going to move into a bit of an example of where we can kind of find where we are on this scale without necessarily taking the IDI, although I do strongly encourage you to look into that, particularly if you are a manager or in the field of human relations or human resources. I think it's really, really great work. All right, so the first stage, and I'm going to go ahead and outline this as the first ethnocentric stage. There are 3 ethnocentric stages, but the first is denial. And I'm just going to outline this. Denial, then defense, minimalization, and then the next 3 stages are then called ethno-relative stages of acceptance, adaptation, and integration. So to repeat that, it goes from denial, defense, minimalization, acceptance, adaptation, and integration. So we're looking at sort of the earlier stages of development, and it doesn't follow any other developmental stages in neurobiology. It's not looking at any other psychological models, particularly age. So you could be at any age and particularly moving into different stages. Now, does that mean that you're better off as you go down through the stages? Well, it does outline itself that way, and that is really kind of the only part of this that I knew was going to be of concern to people, is that they would be upset if they found out that they're in an early stage of ethnocentric experience. Now, the interesting thing is that I didn't get the pushback from over 100 faculty and staff, mainly because I think as academics, we were open to understanding where we were, although many of us might have known that we needed some work in these stages, and those are the people particularly that would be upset, I think, and give a little pushback to doing this kind of testing, especially mandatorily, and this was not a mandatory policy amongst the university. However, as I said, we were a pretty model department, and I continue to carry the torch. Even up until today, I still look back at the development of intercultural sensitivity as really, really solid work, and where I stand as far as my support for Black Lives Matter, my support for Black, Brown, and Indigenous populations and POCs. All right, so let me just quickly go over this and kind of give you some examples of each stage. As I said, the first stage is denial. And this is really evident by people who have their first experience is not to experience the difference. So denial is described as the most ethnocentric stage. It can often be the result of someone's lack of experience with different cultures. For example, this might occur in smaller towns and rural areas where most people share a similar cultural background. And in America, we can kind of visualize what that looks like. Maybe perhaps if you're listening out there, you might be in one of these sort of regions of the world. All right, people on the stage may sometimes be able to distinguish very broad areas of difference, yet they can't really see real intercultural nuance. So for example, they might not be aware of the cultural diversity among people from Asian backgrounds, and they might not be aware that there are actually 43 different countries with Asian lineage. So Bennett makes this all very clear that the most extreme form of denial comes from a belief that these different cultures may actually be less human than one's own. Hence the denial and not wanting to feel that you're a part of this cultural difference, and therefore you are actually accepting this sort of reality of denial, that there is any kind of racism or differences among people. All right, I'm going to move into defense. This stage is where there's an acceptance that differences between cultures do exist. However, the caveat here is that they tend to actually find that these differences appear threatening. Oh my goodness. I'm actually looking at the time here. I'm at minute 10, and I've got 5 stages to go through. All right, so I'm just going to kind of quickly go through. And as you know, for those of you who know me personally, I really just kind of take these 20 minutes and just go for it. There's no editing. So you just heard a blip in my mind, but I'm going to go quickly through the stage now. Defense. The stage is where negative stereotyping against different cultures is employed. There's two additional cues that may help you identify if learners are in this stage. So first you need to look at whether there's some demonstration of perception of cultural superiority. And then also you need to keep an eye out for the opposite, where Bennett would describe a person who perhaps is overzealous, who exalts the host culture while denigrating one's own culture. So maybe some kind of interesting juxtaposition of one's own stance on their own stereotyping. All right, we're going to move into the last stage of ethnocentric stages, and that is minimalization. This is really interesting because here is where Dr. Bennett describes the minimization stage as the last-ditch effort to preserve the centrality of one's own worldview. And I see a lot of people, particularly on the right of politics right now, not the right side, but the right wing, who are kind of in this area of minimalization. And this is a lot of the justification that I think I've been hearing across social media platforms and even in person when people are in this stage. And hopefully this will identify for you some kind of familiarity and that, yeah, you're not going crazy. This is actually happening. So this is when people focus on this sort of universalism that minimizes differences among people. And they say, well, we're all God's children, or I don't see color. Or there's this political expression that might be that of universal rules or principles that govern all different societies. And I'm not one of those people that subscribes to differences. So this is minimizing reality. And that's where I think a lot of people really are. So remember that. That's minimization. All right, so here's where we start to make some headway. For example, ethno-relative stages are kind of where the target is where we want to be in experiencing culture today. And really, if you don't want to experience culture today, well, you might just kind of be stuck in stage one, and that might just be your place. And unfortunately, it's a very narrow, myopic look at the world, and I don't know if you can really survive or even thrive in the first three stages. And this is no reduction of you as a human being. It's just that I think it's really clear that it is kind of a sort of sad reality to have to exist without the knowledge that there's other things around you that may be actually something that could enhance your life, and something that's really, really reality is you're not the only person on this planet. So we have to get out of these ethnocentric stages. Let's move into the ethno-relative stages. And the first one is acceptance. So this is where you have a growing awareness of your own culture and then the recognition also of the other. So you can think of the stage as a key benchmark in the process of learning intercultural sensitivity. So there's two facets of acceptance, and I'm going to go over these. The first is there's an acceptance of behavioral differences among cultures, and then the second is that there's an acceptance of underlying differences in cultural values and worldviews. So the learners who reach this stage will accept that these differences are there without judgment. And I'm not going to go into the Kabat-Zinn sort of approach towards meditation, but that is important to think, where if you can stop and reflect without judgment of whatever thought that crosses your mind, you're kind of in this acceptance learning stage. And this is where you're showing empathy towards those from different backgrounds. You're understanding that the world is not always fair, and the world has been historically not in favor of a lot of brown and black cultures in advancing in society. So you're showing the empathy, and the compassion is real. All right, next up is the ethno-relative stage of adaptation. So this is where you can make tangible changes in your ability to be sensitive to different cultures. And people in this stage go beyond recognizing and just accepting cultural differences. They're also able to adapt their own behavior and their thinking as appropriate and when needed to take those differences into account. So adapting your behavior and changing your thinking and taking those types of differences into account in your own personal existence. So this is a practical sort of top stage in the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. However, it does take it one step further. This stage is where you're recognizing that one needs to be effective in interaction with others. You might be very aware, you're adapting your own behavior and thinking to the sensitivities and difficulties of other people, yet you may not have the effective interaction with others. And that's where the final stage in ethno-relative stages occurs, called integration. And this is where you're internalizing maybe 2 or more, 4 or 5 different cultures. Typically takes 3 or more years, but people who reach this stage fully integrate these cultural differences into their sense of self. So oftentimes this is international workers who can very, with a nice grace, actually code shift and integrate into other different cultures and societies and understand them more readily, so that there is this understanding of internalizing all the differences between these cultures. And this can go all the way from ethnographic studies to history to differences in sociocultural backgrounds of many different societies and cultures. So this is a very difficult stage to arrive at. And I don't even know if people who have arrived there actually feel that they have actually integrated in this stage. But the way you can look at it, even from a distance, is that these people embrace differences as part of the way that they move through their own world. And they don't deny or judge these differences. Instead, they're going to incorporate all the differences into their own worldview. So it's well past acceptance, further along past adaptation, and now they're integrating all these different differences into their worldview. So going back to Dr. Bennett, he wrote that those who reach this final stage experience difference as an essential and joyful aspect of all life. So this just kind of takes me back to my own sort of cultural awareness as a child, and coming up from immigrant parents, living in the Midwest, in Minneapolis and the Chicagoland area, in mid-state Illinois, and then moving later on in life when I was college age. I did have to go through a lot of these stages, experiencing all the different ethnocentric stages at first, and then ethno-relative stages. I approached my life with this idea that I was going to have some kind of joy with experiencing all these different cultures. And I mean, I think this is even why I really relish in the opportunity to, here in Washington, D.C., participate in intercultural language groups and meetups where I get to meet people from 20 different countries in one night. And then maybe go on outings with people who are from other cultures, and I don't speak a lick of any of their languages. And that's sort of the joy that I do think I learned as a young child, and perhaps as an immigrant child, I may have embraced that a little easier in my life, that being kind of the other made it more likely for me to be amongst others. And so, I mean, that's to sort of simplify my existence, but I do think that that has a lot to do with my own trajectory in my own intercultural sensitivity and trajectory in cultural studies. So think about where you are in the things that you do. Think about who it is that you cater to when you go to businesses. Are you frequenting places that have very little POCs or people of color? Are you hiring plumbers and realtors who are POC, or at least culturally sensitive and aware of where they stand with their own cultural sensitivity? Are you donating or helping if you can't be in the front lines? Are you giving to the community around you? And that doesn't just make you a better person, it makes you somebody who understands intercultural life, and that you are not the only force in the world. Although this is who we are as human beings, and if you want to go into race relations, this is why it's so easy to get stuck in ethnocentric stages of nationalism, which I know many of you, if you're listening and you've made it to whatever episode this is, 27, I believe, you probably know how I feel about nationalism and the fact that ethnocentric stages are not really a part of my life and those of my friends and family, because it's such a limiting factor. It's such a very myopic way to live your life. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what it is that we can do to utilize some of these resources, and knowing that this is a thing. So not only are you probably trying to figure out where you are in the 6 stages, do look it up. It's the development of intercultural sensitivity. Again, the 6 stages are denial, defense, minimalization, acceptance, adaptation, and integration. But how do we kind of look at this in real life practice while we interact with others, maybe clients, maybe bosses, maybe subordinates, or maybe coworkers, or even partners? Helping learn where you are is helping the other and you to engage in living. So knowing where you are, and I've said this many times, typically at the end of almost every podcast, I talk about how you have to examine the self. And I'm just going to urge you to consider this, to examine where you are. If it's also difficult to examine where we are in this planet right now, in the depths of a wave of pandemics that we have not seen in 100 years, it's also really important to kind of see where you are in the stages of your own experience. So if we can help ourselves do that, we can help others. And just to talk about a little bit about the care and compassion piece, this is a structural sort of framework in how we can actually help ourselves to engage and behave. It's not to say that we're all going to be in ethno-relative stages overnight. This is a process. If you're interested in taking the IDI, it's an inventory called the Intercultural Developmental Inventory. It's a powerful tool. It definitely helps individuals as well as teams assess and reflect your own stages of cultural sensitivity. And for me, it is something, as I said earlier in the podcast, that has stayed with me for almost 10 years now. And I mean, I stand by a lot of the work that I've done as a professor, and I just want you to hopefully open up some of your own possible ways of looking at yourself and the people around you, to sort of assess your cross-cultural competencies, and also really kind of gauge where you are with working in cross-cultural situations. And I know here in Washington, D.C., and all over the world across a lot of sort of multicultural areas and intercultural areas, this kind of assessment is really essential. So do take the time, step back, understand the developmental stages first, assess where you might be interculturally just by reading through the different stages, and then consider maybe the IDI or just bouncing some ideas off of me. And many of you have been doing that throughout the course of this pandemic. I've been getting some really cool emails and messages from people as to topics that I might be entertaining in the near future. So do keep in contact with me. Let me know how you're coming along, not just interculturally, but as humans on this planet together. I wish you well, and I'll be back again next week for another episode of The Novel Brain with Dr. E. Take care all. Be well.